Good. Welcome, everybody. My name is Bernard Prusak, and I'm the director of the King's McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility. So if you're joining us by Zoom, and most people are joining us by Zoom, this is a little different. If you've been joining us for the last year and change by Zoom, that's all we've done for, I don't know, more than a year and a half. Our last in-person event was February 18, 2020. This is different. It's our first hybrid event, so there are a number of people in the room, and thank you for joining us this evening. And thanks everybody else for joining us by Zoom. So this is our 8th annual Feast of St. Francis lecture. Every year it's focused on a different passion of the poor man of Assisi. This year's theme is building up the church, but interpreted broadly as making room for questions of meaning, purpose, and value in our lives. It's our great fortune to host the painter Brian Whelan. Thanks also to Elaine Little, who will respond to Brian's talk. And I should thank some other people as well. My colleague Joe Strubeck helped me a good bit, and also my colleague Mitchell Tomaszewski, who likewise has helped with technology. So I hope this technology is working well on the Zoom end. Let me do some quick bios. So Brian Whelan is a London-born Irish painter trained at the Royal Academy of Arts. His work has been exhibited and belongs to collections throughout Europe and the United States. For more than 25 years, he lived and worked in England's East Anglia. Since 2013, he has split his time on the UK, United States, Spain, and Ireland. Recently, he moved his studio to Westport, Connecticut, and to learn a lot more about him shortly from the artist himself. I should recognize too that his agent is also with us, Wendy Roseberry. If you want to visit his Brian's studio in Westport, Connecticut, she's the person to ask. I'll share through the chat maybe Wendy's contact information, so long as she gives me the go ahead. Elaine Little is well known to some of us at King's. She currently serves as the director of the Polly Friedman Art Gallery at Misericordia University, where she is also an adjunct professor of fine arts. Elaine holds advanced degrees both in museum education and art history, and her research in Philippine visual culture has been recognized by several fellowships. So thanks again for doing this. Okay, a little bit of nuts and bolts for me. So Brian will talk for about 35 minutes or so, and then Elaine will respond for 5 to 7 minutes, more or less. At that point, we'll turn to Q&A. We'll go until 8:15. Q&A will be a little complicated, so we'll take questions both from our in-person audience and also questions through Zoom, as we've done over these last 19 months. So through Zoom, send questions to me, Bernard Prusak, use the chat, and I'll do my best to introduce your questions into the mix. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on both the McGowan Center's YouTube channel and Facebook page. That probably will happen tomorrow. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you very much, everybody here, and thank you very much, people on Zoom, for joining us. Brian, take it away.
Well, thank you, Bernard, and thank you, Elaine Little, as well. Those are my personal thanks. And also Carol Scholl for making the poster for this event, Dr. Retell itself, and Joe Strubeck for helping with the technicals. Now, I get a lot of people ask me why I paint. I'm still amazed at the question. It's akin to asking, why would you go and see a Shakespearean play? Answer, because they're some of the best stories, and because these plays are part of our language, a rich part of our culture. I persuaded a friend who'd never seen a Shakespeare play to go to the theatre to see one. What do you think? I said. He said, Brian, it was just for the cliche. It could have been said of the Bible. My question to myself 40 years ago was, how on earth do you retell a familiar narrative that has been told over and over again and had it sparkle? I concluded that what was needed was a glorious collision between profound thought and a sense of fun and irony. I don't mean this to sound derogatory about my religious subject matter, but for me, it's like the punchline of a joke. That place where irreconcilable thoughts and ideas collide. And in that split second, you're open to the impossible and the sublime. Hence the pun in the title of this talk, which is Praying the Game. The question I asked myself all those years ago was, where do I find that spark? The answer came in an epiphany I had 20 years ago, a moment when it all became clear. A moment when the thing right under my nose was what I'd been looking for 40 years. One irony that's clear to me now when asked why I paint religious pictures is that anyone who is interested in the history of art should have noticed that it is largely, overwhelmingly, the history of religious art. 2,000 years of it and more. Why turn your back on that? Even the Lascaux caves in France, many experts believe, has a religious dimension to it. How could it not? You think of Egyptian art in the tombs, Greek gods, goddesses. Considering that, when art surely is always a balance between content and form, why is that content, when it has religious content, often ignored? A little background about myself. To be clear, I didn't start school as a gifted artist or someone who had received a divine call to be a priest. I was bottom of my religious education class. I went to art school because it was free. If my parents had to pay for my education, it would not have happened. At that time in the UK, students were lucky enough to have education fees paid for, including maintenance, materials, equipment, with subsidized travel costs and lodgings. Further education was free for every subject. When that happens, you don't even need to consult your parents, who, if I had asked them, would have said, well, how are you going to make a living after this? I enjoyed art. It was the only thing I was half good at. I love the history of art lectures where I was introduced to paintings of the Last Supper, crucifixions, Madonnas with Child by Caravaggio, Michelangelo, Giotto, Masaccio, but the content of their work was never discussed. What was taught was the processes, the innovations, color theory, perspective, chiaroscuro, anatomy, the golden section, and how to stretch and prime a canvas. I explored and experimented. Like a good student, I painted my way through the history of art. Impressionism, expressionism, abstract expressionism, minimalism, synthetic cubism, analytic cubism, and all the rest. Young artists are expected to learn all of these things, and then when you have learned all these things, they are expected to invent an original personal style. It's a tall order. And last of all, you had to find a subject. Now, I came from an Irish Catholic family. I went to a Catholic comprehensive school in London, what you in the US would call a public school. 85% of the pupils were Irish or second generation Irish, like myself. Most of the rest were Catholic Poles. That means Polish. The school tried to deny our Irish roots at a time in the 70s when the so-called troubles between the UK and the Republic of Ireland were headline news. They hoped we would identify as good Catholics and not Irish at all. But to be frank, in Protestant England, being Catholic was almost the same as being Irish. We didn't see much difference. Getting back to art school, looking back, I now see clues to what was going to happen. We were asked to do a transcription. If you don't know what a transcription is, it's an investigation into a painting. You don't copy it, but you engage with it. Find out about it. Enjoy what it has to offer. For art students, the best way to understand anything is to try and draw it. We each had a choice of 5 or 6 paintings at the National Gallery in London. I chose El Greco's The Cleansing of the Temple. Out of the 25 to 30 students, I was the only one who chose this religious scene. The other choices were landscapes, still lifes, and portraits. Later, when we could please ourselves about what we wanted to paint, I did a crucifixion with the good thief and the bad thief on the crosses either side of Jesus. I found the head of the art school sitting in my studio chair when I came back from lunch. He was very congratulatory about the work, that is, the paint work, but finished his tutorial by putting the question, don't you think this could be so much better if you turn the painting upside down so we didn't have to think about the content? My 7 years at art school ended with a postgrad at the Royal Academy, where I should mention, I didn't meet anyone with a Catholic Irish background. I was also, and this is far more serious, totally unemployable. Then, like Jesus, I spent many years in the wilderness, during which time, still thinking about a subject and a style to paint in, I asked myself, do I belong to any tradition? Was there such a thing as a London Irish experience? Any ambition I had as an artist seemed pretty hopeless. I moved out of London to the rural English counties of Norfolk and Suffolk, that's East Anglia. Suffolk has the most amazing collection of medieval churches anywhere in the world. Norfolk, slightly less, but the capital city of Norfolk, which is Norwich, has the most complete medieval street in Europe. They say that before the Reformation, Norwich had 52 churches, one for every week of the year, and 365 pubs, one for every day of the year. I know what you're thinking, why so many churches? Praying can be very thirsty. If you gain access to a tower of a Suffolk medieval church and look out over the countryside, you will see in the distance 2 or more other wonderful towers of medieval churches. Some of these churches seem to be out of all proportion to the size of the village they're in. Impressive though they are, there was something disappointing about them. Inside, they had been stripped by the Reformation. Whitewashed walls, stained glass replaced with clear glass, sculptures with no heads, alcoves empty of content. What the Reformation missed, the Puritan Oliver Cromwell finished off. When I left art school, and after many jobs, most of which I was sacked from, I was offered a job working for the Arts Council of Great Britain. I was very lucky. I had a 1-day-a-week job working with craftspeople. And when the year was up, my line manager, who I was very friendly with and taught me a lot, had a heart attack and died. I was the only one in the office who knew what was going on. They gave me his job, organizing festivals, theatre programs, workshops, and exhibitions. It was a great job. It was stressful, but very rewarding. I needed an artist to design the sets for a pantomime, which, if you are not familiar with, is a kind of children's theatre that adults love just as much. I found my designer in Andrew Smith, who was born and bred in Suffolk. He invited me to an exhibition he was having, and I went along to have a look. I was shocked, surprised, and gratified to see Andrew had exhibited small paintings on religious subjects, and I almost felt a pang of envy. I was able to put titles to all his paintings, and he told me no one else he had met could do that. He put that down to my knowledge and understanding of religious art, down to me being a Catholic. Andrew was an Anglican, Church of England. Norfolk and Suffolk, despite those magnificent medieval Anglican churches, was mostly nonconformist, that is Quaker, Baptist, Methodist, Bethel, Salvation Army, and others. So his work was mostly ignored, but he loved these subjects so much, he could not stop painting them. I told Andrew my thoughts about the local churches and how I was impressed with the exterior and size, but disappointed with the interiors. They were just whitewashed, empty of anything of interest, I said. Not all, he responded, if you know where to go. For the next 3 months, we would meet up every Saturday morning, drive out and visit 2 or 3 local churches. Looking back, this was a magical period of discovery for me. Andrew showed me fragments of art that we both considered precious gems. Corbels, roof bosses, paintings reappearing through the lime wash hundreds of years later. we saw lots of art that, despite the damage done to them, somehow still told their stories. I felt, in fact, we both felt, a close connection to these works, as though this secret belonged to us. And remember, none of this work was in the history books as taught to us at art school. The moment of my epiphany came when we were in a village called Wenhaston. Wenhaston has something called the Wenhaston Doom. Doom being the common medieval word for Last Judgment. A 20-foot long by 15-foot high painting on wooden panels. The story behind the discovery of this painting is fascinating. When the Victorians were renovating the church in 1892, they removed anything infested with Death Watch beetle and woodrot. They pulled out a wooden panel in the chancel arch and threw it in the churchyard. The rain came and washed off a layer of lime wash to reveal the doom. It had probably been painted just before the Reformation of 1534, so in a strange way, the lime wash protected the painting. The colours were still clear. The figures were almost life-size. To describe the doom, Archangel Michael and the devil share out the souls. Behind the devil are the jaws of hell, in which people acted out the 7 deadly sins. They are being herded in by devils with pitchforks, and behind Michael we see angels welcoming in the virtuous into castellated mansions of heaven. The mortals are all naked, as we are all equal before God, and rank does not matter. But, so that we know who they are all wearing hats. The crown for a king, a mitre for a bishop, cap for a butcher, and other obscure headgear no longer identifiable. This and other medieval paintings we saw were about the monumental subjects of life, death, love, sacrifice, pain, hope, cruelty, faith, the miraculous, the impossible. They tell stories we still tell today. I have no doubt there were some portraits in there of local villagers in the guise of the sinful and the blessed. Perhaps an unpopular priest put in the jaws of hell. Amusing at times and sometimes hilarious in their wit and naivety, but also sophisticated and courageous in their ambition. All painted by anonymous artists who never signed their work. This storytelling was what gripped me. Simple storytelling by one or perhaps several painters working within a tradition with a vast cast of characters that everyone at the time understood, literate and illiterate alike. To a medieval viewer, very little needed to be explained. Saints showed emblems as signs of their identity. For example, keys for St. Peter. St. Lucy with her eyes on a plate, patron saint of opticians. And St. Stephen with a stone stuck to his head as he was stoned to death as the first Christian martyr. The actions of the participants in the painting and their identity created the narrative, and like actors in a play, offered the chance for an artist to create and recreate stories with subtle or dramatic changes of emphasis. It's not generally realized that the religious paintings we are familiar with, some nativities and such like, were painted in a way that reflected the age in which they were painted. You can date the work of art by what people are wearing in the painting. No attempt was made to be authentic to the date of Christ's life. The scene was painted to appear contemporary. I wanted the same indulgence. So, this is where my definitive journey as an artist began, and it was just outside my own studio door, in the medieval churches and dwellings of Norfolk and Suffolk. Vestiges of this medieval art form resonated with my Catholic roots, back to a time when there was one church, not a split church, and from its painted walls, great stories were told, depicting a sublime comedy of life's glories and tragedies. Before the Reformation, hundreds and perhaps thousands of shrines dotted the English landscape. England was known as Mary's dowry, as there were so many shrines dedicated to her. The pilgrims expected to find shelter in the churches, but to avoid damaging the fabric of the building, the church built a hostel or an inn next to the church. Now that they had somewhere to rest their weary heads, they needed something to drink. We know that beer was safer than water to drink in those days. So beside most medieval churches, you will find a medieval pub. In those mornings when Andrew and I visited a few medieval churches, it was only natural for us to want to sample the local brew. Typical names include Abbot Ale, Ale Mary, Resurrection Bitter, Fallen Angel. I bought myself a copy of the Real Ale Guide with lists of breweries and pubs. I found easily 6 real ales with religious names. Many saints were given their names to breweries. Breweries have their own patron saints. St. Bridget, who turned bathwater into beer, and St. Arnold, who has the mash rake as his emblem. There was also countless pub names that had a direct connection to the church. For example, the Grapes, the Cardinal's Hat, the Trip to Jerusalem, claimed to be the oldest pub in England, the Pilgrim, the Angel, the Three Kings, the Three Crowns, the Salutation, which Gabriel gave to Mary at the Annunciation, the Shepherd and Flock, the Bishop, the Catherine Wheel, Cross Keys, George and the Dragon, the Dove, the Loaves and Fishes, the Rosary Tavern, St. Andrew's Tavern, St. John's Head, the Ark, the Vine, the Lamb and Flag, the Lion and the Lamb, and Adam and Eve's, the oldest pub in Norwich City, built by Benedictine monks to satisfy the thirst of the men shifting stones that built the cathedral in the 12th century. Our local brewery was called St. Peter's Brewery, and it was built in the stone remains of a convent, dissolved during the Reformation. In fact, the breweries that once was sited within Norwich city walls were all built on the sites of dissolved monasteries, because the monasteries had the best water supplies for brewing. Further evidence that the church was no stranger to the fruits of fermentation. Some of these names got distorted over time or disguised. The Hope and Anchor is a quote from St. Paul. Hope is an anchor to faith. The Compass, or the Goat and Compass, is a strange name, and it's derived from God encompasseth us all. To this, you could add other pub names like the Crown of Thorns, the Star of Bethlehem. In our musings over a pint, Andrew and I decided to put on an exhibition. We found a building once used as a pump house, built during the Victorian times. This pump house was disguised to look like a chapel, arched windows, and one cross-shaped window. Perfect for what we had in mind. We decided to call the show the Church Pub, a name both challenging to some and also part of casual talk. If you needed to meet someone in a certain village, you might say, "I'll meet you in the church pub." Without having to know the name of the pub, it was just the church, the pub next to the medieval church. Our local St. Peter's Brewery kindly gave us a barrel of beer for the exhibition's opening. Blue Nun Wine gave us 168 bottles of red and white wine for the opening. We decorated a table with vine leaves and all the foods we could find mentioned in the Bible: grapes, figs, bread, wine, fish, and olives. The paintings were pretty common subjects for a medieval church: the Blessed Virgin Mary, St. Peter, Archangel Michael, death, the Green Man, seen on the outside of every medieval church, Angel Gabriel, and so on. But all the labels to identify the paintings described real ales that had the same name. There you have that collision I was talking about. Almost 200 people came to the opening night. And with all that food, beer and wine, it was obviously a great success. I had sold very little of my work up to that date. The thought wasn't even on my radar. But when the evening was over, my sister said how sad she was that I didn't sell any paintings at all. Andrew sold one painting, I think, to a member of his family, and later on that week declared he was going to make his parents proud of him and go to teacher training college. my sister took my half of the show down to the Hammersmith Irish Arts Centre in London, mainly a social club, theatre and music venue. They agreed to put the church pub on, and for the first time in their history as an arts centre, made a nice catalogue. On the first night, I sold 8 paintings. Mixing church and pub together could be claimed as an Irish tradition, and they love the humour. Incidentally, it has been noted that the last line of defence for the church in a declining village is the pub. If the pub goes, the village will always lose its functioning church, and the building will become a monument. The church being a formal place to break bread, and the pub the informal place to break bread. I had found my audience, one that wasn't worried about the link between the church and the pub, one that was equal to creative, playful indulgence of the collision of these themes, and didn't feel threatened by the humour. Some of you may have noticed the Catholic endorsement of this work, in contrast with lack of endorsement or the suspicion of those outside the Catholic faith. But that was not to last. It took 5 years before the Church of England was to have anything to do with me, but the time came without me looking for it. The village next to the one we were living in was called Hoxton. It had a beautiful pub built in the 15th century. It was reputed that it stands close to where the once patron saint of England, St. Edmund, was martyred in 869. There are a number of places in Suffolk and Norfolk that also claim the site of his martyrdom. But I go with Hoxton because not only do they have a monument to the saint, but also an annual beer festival in his name, and it's on the 20th of November. I asked the landlord if, during the festival, he would be willing to exhibit above the fireplace a painting of the martyrdom of St. Edmund, and he agreed. The festival was a big success. Edmund was slaughtered in Hoxton over 1,000 years ago, and the people of Hoxton continue that tradition and get slaughtered there to this day. I had several approaches to buy the painting, and not all of them were drunk. But I refused to sell it. 2 years later, I got a call from the secretary to the Friends of St. Edmundsbury Cathedral asking if the bishop could see the painting he had heard so much about. I took it up to the cathedral and the bishop acquired it on the spot. From demon drink to Holy Spirit. The painting had in fact followed the route Edmund's body took from martyrdom in Hoxton to St. Edmunds, where a shrine was built and pilgrims for hundreds of years travelled to. A couple of months after that painting was acquired by the cathedral, I visited to see where it was hung. I found it in a dark corner of the cathedral behind stacks of chairs. I appreciated that acquiring a new piece of art for a cathedral can be controversial. Perhaps the friends of the cathedral or the parish council were not in agreement with the bishop. They had paid for the painting so they could do what they liked with it. I went in again weeks later and it was in a different place. A slightly better place, not behind the stacked chairs at any rate. Then about a year later, Wendy and I chose Bury St. Edmund's registry office to get married. After the ceremony, we thought it would be nice to visit the cathedral and to get to our great surprise, after much searching, we found the martyrdom of St. Edmund in the Lady Chapel and close to the altar, positioned beautifully with a row of chairs and candles in front, and a box to put requests for prayers to the priest. I was so happy both to be married, but this was a marriage gift to both of us. We literally jumped up and down with glee until a very cross woman came into the Lady Chapel and dressed us down severely for our noisy disrespect for the sanctity of God's house. Did we not know where we were? We removed ourselves sheepishly. Eventually, a message got back to me that clergy considered my depiction of St. Edmund's to be a breath of fresh air. It still hangs in the Lady Chapel to this day, and I hope will be there for hundreds of years. I was now beginning to feel like a one-man counter-reformation. All this happened in the years 2000 to 2005. I noticed with the rise of craft beers in the US, I see that religious names are all the fashion. It is something I hadn't seen when I visited the US as a tourist at the end of the 1970s. Religious allusions have now become a branding style, but one without the historic roots of those ancient traditions of hospitality that the pilgrims relied on in pursuit of grace. I leave you with one thought, and that thought is the best literary example of what I have just spoken about, the Canterbury Tales. The stories of pilgrims, just like Andrew and I, who met in a pub and tell bawdy and morality tales to each other on their pilgrimage to Thomas Becket's shrine in Canterbury. A 14th century tale, not so very different from what Andrew and I did at the beginning of the 21st century. I was part of a long tradition after all. Now, we have some examples here of some work that I've done. I'll tell you, these two paintings here, closest, and these two here, they were in an exhibition called Voices of Immigrants. And even though these paintings fit very nicely into that theme, they also have religious roots connected to them. Now, the first painting over here, which is "I Never Knew So Many Were Undone," is a direct quote from Dante's Divine Comedy. But it really refers to a far more personal root, which is that both my parents were born in the decade between 1930 and 1940, and statistics show that my parents who left Ireland in the 50s, the statistics showed that 4 out of every 5 Irish born between 1930 and 40 left Ireland to work abroad. I thought that was an extraordinary statistic, but when I looked at my family on both my father's side and my mother's side, I realized that our statistics were even worse than that. It was 5 out of 6, in fact. So that I've done a whole series of paintings on the Divine Comedy, and that one fitted in with the immigration. So I'll leave that one for a moment. We'll come over to here. I mentioned the relationship between the church and the pub. This painting beautifully illustrates it. So we've got the church here, we've got a pub a couple of doors down. This is a part of London, Hanwell, where I grew up. And when we moved into this part of London, this church didn't exist. It was built by the pennies that were collected in this pub here. There was a shed there for a little while, and people used to go to mass there, but it was never big enough. And there'd be queues down the road. But you can see how important the pub and the church go together here. Now, at the top of this painting, there's a boat full of they're not monks or brothers, let's say. This refers to the ancient Irish tradition of getting in a boat and casting yourself off, nothing but a prayer and a sail and an oar, at the will of God, God's will. And on this side, you've got Ryanair, which is the more modern way of doing it. So I call them brothers because my father came over to England. He was one of 8 brothers. So I just think these are my father and my father's brothers together. And everything in this painting, there's a convent here. My sister had a first Holy Communion. And my cousin asked his wife to marry him at this bus stop in front of this church. And there's the library. So everything in this painting has a connection to me. This Irish music is very important. Obviously, everybody knows what Céilí is, and people getting together and improvising. This one I've turned into, it's got a religious connection because it's Saint Cecilia, who was a patron saint of music. So this is the sign of that it is Saint Cecilia. I've written at the top just to help some people. But Irish people, it's interesting that of all the things, Irish culture is, they're well known for music, aren't they, and literature and poetry, but paintings is not something. Does anyone know what can name an Irish artist, an Irish visual artist? Probably not, see. So I'm filling a gap. One of the stories are that she was a virgin, and when she was being asked to she got married, and she said, I do not want to have sex with you, but I want you to become a Christian. And when he did, and he went to see her, he could see an angel standing beside her. And the angel put a garland of flowers on her head, which is why she's offered a garland of flowers on her head. This is a bit like one of those collisions I was telling you about, like a joke, when two things, irreconcilable ideas just come together. And it makes people laugh, but at the same time, I feel, it's a very simple painting to understand, isn't it? It's the battle between good and evil. I can tell you a funny story about this, which is, I exhibited this at the Washington National Cathedral. And it was at the time of the election between Hillary and Donald Trump. And so people were able to say who they thought was the devil and who was the Christ. But it was interesting that no one actually divulged what their politics were. They didn't need to, because they just had this to, oh, I know who that is, or I know who that is. But even funnier than that was, quite close to the cathedral is the Soviet embassy. It's not Soviet anymore, Russian embassy. And they were having an election a couple of weeks before the American one. And by the way, they said that the Americans were, fiddling with their election results as well. But and I saw a group of Russians after voting, they would come in to the cathedral and have a look around, and they saw this. And I saw a big bunch of Russians laughing away. They were looking at the devil and they were laughing away. And I asked them, "What's that?" I said, "What is it? What's so funny about it?" They said, most Americans think that this is Russia, but we know it's America. And then a woman said, she said, not Russia, she said, don't they know that this is America? God in the middle, referee. So anyway, that's created an awful lot of fun. And I think it's interesting that, let's say people could imagine who these people were without having to resort to personal insults, which never came about. So this painting here, this is, it's called Flotsam and Jensen. It does refer to, the immigrant experience again. But it's inspired by a miracle that happened in a cathedral called Clonmacnoise, where monks were praying and a boat floated through the interior of the cathedral, dragging its anchor. Seamus Heaney's written a poem about it, such an amazing poem called Lightning, or Lightning. And then the anchor got hooked on the altar rail, stopping the boat from carrying on, and all the monks got together and they hauled the anchor down and tried to help the monks who were climbing down the rope to try and unhook themselves. And the idea basically is that both were looking at each other in amazement that each other existed. There was a lightning. Again, it was like this collision again, between two ideas, two irreconcilable ideas, floating. Anyway, and I did that was at the back of my mind when I did this, but Flotsam and Jensen is the stuff, the rubbish that floats around in the water. And actually, you know what? After this painting went up, I suddenly realized, remember those scenes in Kabul, people grabbing hold of the aircraft and falling off? I was like, oh, goodness, this is an illustration. And then lastly, this is Archangel Michael. Now, this is the only painting left from the Church Pub exhibition that I did, and when I didn't sell anything. And then I later started to. So this is the only one left, and it's a nice piece of work. I don't know why it hasn't gone yet. And if you look closely, you'll see that his whole armor, or the mail, is made up of chocolate wrappers. I integrate those into my work often, but I feel like I need. So there's nothing quite so grand as gold leaf or anything. What's nice about this is that because people know I use them, they send me little envelopes full of chocolate wrappings, and then they go into paintings. I feel like it's also a comment on the Reformation in the funny sort of way, because that was a confusion about the meaning and the value, the sort of precious financial value of something and the meaning contained within. I'm still using the traditions, the painterly traditions of painting from the medieval style, but because this is just modern detritus I'm using to make this, I can't be accused of making anything precious. It's just a piece of wool with some chocolate wrappers on. But the message inside is far more important. Right, I think I've probably bored you enough.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was wonderful. He's a wonderful storyteller. Oh, hang on, let me unmask myself. Thank you all for those really wonderful stories. My name is Lelaine Mangilan Little. I'm the director of the Polly Friedman Art Gallery at Misericordia University. And as Brian said, these 4 works behind me were part of our exhibition Voices Immigration for the last 6 weeks, featuring along with Brian, artists from Ecuador, Jamaica, Laos, the Philippines, and the former USSR. So walking past these works every day and then showing to our students and our campus this fall, I'm honored to be able to present this response to Brian's work and bid a fond farewell to my old friends here. I want to thank Brian and Wendy for participating in our programs at Misericordia, and thanks to Bernard Prusak and the McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility for bringing Brian's work to my attention. As these paintings have an appealing familiarity to them, I'd like to briefly just situate these works among moments in art history and help our viewers sort of formulate questions and learn how to engage with these. So we'll do the first slide. So one of the first impressions I got of Brian's work, I was reminded of the French-Russian modern artist Marc Chagall's stained glass installation, American's Windows, from 1977 at the Art Institute of Chicago. This work not only uses a highly saturated palette, but relies on line to suggest the contours of the human figure. In Chagall, those various contours suggest constant movement and creativity, whereas in I Never Knew So Many Were Undone on the right, my right, by duplicating the contours of the human figure in white against brown and rust-colored tones against the 2 distinct fields of green and blue, Brian's able to achieve the opposite effect of dread and resignation. So my thought, I have a couple of thought questions for the audience, just to sort of spur your own questions. But for me, this painting has such clear divisions between foreground and background, as well as that split between the 2 hills and the line of people. Can we relate those kinds of things? And in my case, or in the case of the context of our show, can we relate that to struggles about being displaced and what can we make of those visual divisions? Can I look at the next one, please? In the title of Van Gogh's Starry Night, Saint-Remy, 1889, that would suggest a captured moment of a single celestial event, but in fact, Van Gogh painted it over several sessions and applied thicker and thicker strokes of paints to increase that vivid contrast of night. His stay at Saint Remy was at a time when he was seeking relief from his mental illness, and perhaps this was a way of quieting his mind. By contrast, the sky in Whelan's Flotsam and Jensen also brings an intense energy as the 3 figures cling to each other in a churning sky of white swirls, the 3rd losing a shoe as a 4th figure grasps his hand, his body only just emerging from the lower edge of the frame. Rather than a peaceful blue village of the Van Gogh painting, bright yellow and red skyscrapers threaten to prick the soles of the feet of the 3 men as 2 white-haired figures lean over the edge anxiously of the rowboat above. So you're thinking about this. How do you see displacement or even immigration in the context of our show? Is it kind of rescue, or is it a story of rejection like Flotsam and Jensen? The next one, please. For a third comparison, I chose Faith Ringgold's Char Beach 2, one of her many storytelling quilts. Like Whelan's Broadway, Ringgold's Cityscape incorporated buildings that she had a personal connection to. They both distort the picture plane, and that just means that it's a little bit skewed so that the surface of horizontal objects exists in the same space as the side view of a vertical object. The play with scales as well allows the viewer to see the intimate details of Ringgold's memories. The mismatched chairs at the kitchen table, for example. What's especially delightful in terms of building familiarity is that careful placement of text. And in Ringgold's, along the top of the red building, kind of in the back underneath those angels, it says the Goody Goody Ice Cream Factory. And in Brian's work, he has also carefully placed text, such as the word London on the bus, the Shell station. So my question regarding this pairing is this placement of red and white create this very specific journey through the London neighborhood. How has Brian's use of color evolved? And this was done in 2007 to now. Next one, please. And for the work St. Cecilia, I chose two moments in art history. The first, Max Beckmann's Blind Man's Buff from 1945. And Beckmann was an artist whose work was highly allegorical, although the artist himself declined to offer any sort of legend to decoding his works. We can more generally say that Beckmann often returned to the format of the triptych, its religious format, in this case, removed from its religious context and filled with images of temptations. The stylistic details of import here is the heavy outline and the overlapping of space that was so characteristic of German artists practicing during this era as a way of bringing all subjects to equal attention, as opposed to fading into the distance as was characteristic of more classical art traditions. The second example, which is early modern Ethiopian artists who modeled their Christian devotional items after conventions of European painting, and that was under the missionary efforts by the Portuguese. What's interesting about the comparison with St. Cecilia, Fine Girl You Are, is that although the shape and coloring of the figures is reminiscent of these other disparate traditions, the overhead perspective of this circle of musicians around the table seem to invite and embrace the viewer into this gathering. So my question for Brian is this a new direction in which you're working more with the circle rather than the strict horizontal registers of other works?
Do you want to answer that now?
If you want people to mull questions or think about questions, it doesn't.
No.
Thank you very much to Lillian. Thank you for your fine talk. So we'll do Q&A. And if people here in the room have some questions, that's great. Ask your question to Brian, who'll then repeat it so people on Zoom can hear. Everybody else on Zoom, please send me questions through the chat. And I'll go look at the chat now. So I think you can field questions from the audience.
Yeah.
How's that?
Okay.
Okay. All right, here we go.
If you have the question, I'll probably repeat it. So, yeah.
Yeah, do you have a piece, painting that you consider to be your masterpiece?
No, it's a kind of ongoing. Oh, do I have a painting which I would consider to be a masterpiece? No, I don't think I could ever allow myself to feel that. Because I think when you're an artist, you're always dissatisfied. You know, that's why you carry on doing it. Actually, a young student once said to me, you know, how do you feel about the fact that, you know, I've just done a piece of artwork and I'm completely happy with it. No one can do anything better than I've just done. You know, and I said, well, that means you're not an artist because you don't see anything wrong with it. You know, so every painting I've ever done is in two parts, in the sense that I have an idea. Halfway through, I realize, oh my goodness, it's all gone horribly wrong. I don't know whether to carry on with it, and so I'll put it away for quite a long time. It might be 6 months, could be 2 years, 3 years, and I'll take it out again. And then with that distance of time, I look at it and think, I can now only see what's good about it and not what's bad about it. So I'll carry on with it and finish it, but I still have then an ambition to do something else. You know? So there's no perfection to be able to be attained. But I do feel better about my work if I haven't seen it for a long time. You know, put it away, took it out. Lane, your question, is working with a circle more possibly the future? I don't think so. I tell you, it is. I have done paintings. I think I did Balthazar's Feast with a similar kind of idea, and it's too. You know, I can't do too many paintings in the same structure. I've got to find new ways all the time. So if you recognise, I mean, I hope that these paintings are all different in design and structure. But I have got some which might look, you know, like I said, Balthazar's Feast might look quite like that in a way. I think I put the king over to one side there a little bit, but looking down onto a table is something I've done quite a lot. And as you know, I do twist and different perspectives, try and find ways of incorporating just to. I've never liked the idea of working from life. I was very aware of the limitations of it when I was a student. I thought, you know, some students who love looking at anatomy or, you know, butterflies or whatever, and they get tighter and tighter and tighter. I thought that was a dead end, you know, because it limited what you could do, and you always had to have an object. I was busy trying to find a way of painting where I could use my imagination a lot more and draw on and memory a lot more. I use my memory an enormous amount. It's much better than it was 10, 20 years ago. My memory. I can remember things visually very much better. Another question?
Yeah, one of the first things you said was, how do you like the challenge for you is how do you retell a narrative that has been told over and over and over again?
Yeah.
And I couldn't help but think about the kind of similarity there to preaching in, in our liturgical context.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
And I wondered what feeds you, or what do you like? What well do you continue to dip from for inspiration and for like continual freshness in that regard?
Yeah. Yes. The question is, how do you find that spark in a subject matter which everybody's familiar with and has lost its sparkle? And the same thing could be true of the clergy doing a sermon or something. How you say the mass over and over again. How could you make it more interesting or give it its sparkle back? And for me, you may have noticed that. I mean, humor is an example of that sparkle. Not so much now because I'm in America, but when I used to go to pubs a lot in England, I found an enormous amount of energy in those conversations. And if I was laughing, because people think they don't know anything about religious subjects, say, oh, I'm not into religion or whatever. And then you might talk about one of the subjects, and it turns out they know an enormous amount about it, particularly atheists. They seem to know an awful lot about the Bible and the saints and those sorts of things. So when I was faced to go to a pub, I used to, if I got a gag out of it or I was laughing, I just thought, oh, there's some energy in there. That's going to set me off and get me started. So it's something that is, and don't think of a joke as just being something funny. It's that, as I say, irreconcilable thoughts that come together. There's a sort of that contradiction gives it energy. So that's what I sort of look for. And if I'm painting now, I haven't laughed during the making of that painting, so I think it's a failure. Maybe it isn't, but I feel it's a failure. Thank you for that question. It's a good one. And I think about that in terms of the clergy often. How on earth do you keep doing this? But I mean, if you're an actor in a Shakespearean play, you might have a run that lasts a year. You have got to find something new in it each time, haven't you, to keep it going? Otherwise, the audience knows, I think, they can detect it. Other question?
We have a question from Zoom. So similar. Do you find yourself returning to certain stories repeatedly? Do you have favorite stories or symbols that you are drawn to paint in different ways?
Yeah, there's a Zoom question, and am I drawn to certain subjects over and over again? Are there themes, I call them? Yes, I do have themes that I return to often. In fact, that's how I paint, and I will revisit a theme, a couple of years down the line, 5 years down, and 10 years down the line. I'm in a fortunate position where I have kept an awful lot of my old work, and the work that might be 30 or 40 years old, when I wasn't a very good artist, I feel like I'm much better now. And I see that work and I can do it again. I won't do it exactly the way it is, obviously. I'll be looking at the theme and think, oh, I know a better way of doing that. And also, as people now on my website, they will say, I'm looking for a painting on St. Anthony. Have you got on anything on St. Anthony? And I'll be able to send them 2 or 3 examples of a painting of St. Anthony, and then they can choose what they want. And so I often sell through the internet like that. But any subject, I mean, Flight Me to Egypt, I think I've got 2 or 3 of those paintings. They're all different, and they're all different sizes as well. If I change the scale or something, or if I make it horizontal rather than vertical, it'll completely change how I'm going to design that painting. So the answer to your question is yes, I have lots of themes I will return to. Not to necessarily favourite, but they're exciting when I'm doing them. And then when the excitement wears off, I put them away. Actually, a long time ago, I used to destroy any work I wasn't happy with, and that was ridiculous until I met a very great artist, Arthur Boyd, and he said, "You would destroy your work? He said, that's very self-indulgent." I never thought of it as being self-indulgent. I always thought it was self-indulgent to go and buy another canvas, rather than use the same one and whitewash it and do another. But when I stopped, I suddenly found out I had a lot of work, and it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. So I went back and had another go at it. Good advice. Yes?
I grew up outside of Chicago, so I was able to, see Chagall's American Window many times, and I really appreciated the comparisons that Dr. Little made between your work and the work of other artists.
Yeah.
I'm curious about a resonance I heard in your own experience of epiphany in that in the English countryside when you saw the work, the medieval work depicting the Last Judgment, the Doom. And it made me think of a movie that Kenneth Branagh made in the late 80s, before he really became known here in this country, that starred both him and Colin Firth. And Colin Firth played an artist who restored a Last Judgment scene in an English country church. It was called A Month in the Country, I think. I'm just wondering whether you're familiar with that film at all, and whether that has any resonance for
No,
you.
I don't know the film. Never seen it. That sounds interesting. Maybe I should Google it and try and watch it. Interesting you say you asked about Chagall and that you come from Chicago and Chagall is there. Some of his work is there. Sometimes people do draw an analogy between Chagall and my work, actually, and it's interesting because I don't look at Chagall's work. I mean, it's very seductive. If I did, I think he might have too much of an influence on me because it's beautiful art. But what we have in common is that we're both looking at the same source material, I think, in a way. If you think of his flying figures and stuff, I mean, that's not very different from a religious painting with angels and saints flying around. I mean, the Jewish don't have a strong visual arts tradition in the same way that particularly Catholicism has. So then he needed to find one and then make it his own, which he did very, very successfully. But his source material is very similar. And it's unfortunate sometimes when people say, "Oh, you've been looking at Chagall." I say, "Well, no, I haven't. I've been looking at what Chagall has been looking at. That's what I've been doing."
Thank you.
What's the name of that film again?
A Month in the Country.
A Month in the Country. That was the name of the film. Okay. Another question.
Yes, so when you asked us to think of an Irish artist,
Yeah.
the mind of this person immediately went to the murals that cover Belfast and Derry in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on why this medium would be perhaps the most common way to represent the Troubles? You have to
Wow,
repeat
that's a
that.
lot. I have to say that.
You have to repeat it.
You're right. The question is, I asked if anyone could name an Irish artist, and this person's question doesn't actually name an Irish artist, but he names, or she names, the murals in Northern Ireland, political murals in Northern Ireland. And the question was, sorry, Bernard.
Why is that medium the most common way to represent the
Right.
Troubles?
Why is that medium the most common way of representing the Troubles? That's a very good question. Those murals are not respected as works of art at all amongst the experts, the historians. It probably suffers the same fate that until very recently, naive artists in this country, and which seems to be black artists have been working in a naive style, and they're starting to be celebrated, which is wonderful because I think some of their work is fantastic. It's more stimulating to me than a lot of other genres. So this art is from the people, and therefore it's not, it's not elitist in any way. It's not educated. It isn't somebody. These aren't artists that have studied perspective and all these other things. It's almost imperative that it doesn't do that, actually, because it's meant to be from the people, from the grassroots. I think that's, if it was wonderfully illusionistic or whatever, it would defeat its purpose, I think. That's an interesting subject, and I'm still struggling answering that, really. And I've been around Northern Ireland. I've seen both murals. They say you need a different taxi cab to go and see the Protestant ones or see the Loyalist one. You need another one to see the Catholic Republican ones. And unfortunately, as we were driving around, the hairs on the back of my head kept going up and down. So it shows you how powerful they are when you see them. Not all for positive reasons, obviously, but so anyway, that's my answer. Not a complete one, I'm afraid, but I'll go away and think about that more. Thank you for the question. Any other questions? Yes?
I love the use of the chocolate wrappers. Have you ever used any other medium to add spark to?
Not sparkle, but in the painting. Oh, so the question is, have I used anything else apart from chocolate wrappers in my paintings that sparkle? And I don't. Actually, there is a yogurt pot at the top there. It's not chocolate wrappers, but I think I put a yogurt pot in there. And the painting of Broadway, there are the sign that says London and then Pride on the other side. Those are beer bottle labels. And in the pub, it's got Fuller's, which is the name of a brewery. So I have been, and I've done a lot of paintings of London, I have been steaming off the labels and then making them into advertisements that go on the buses and in the pubs and, you know, all over the city. So that's the other thing I collect. And I particularly collect the beer labels that have religious names attached. So,
Two more questions from Zoom, and if there are any more. So
okay.
one question, have you ever thought about going back to the places you know, that gave you these memories and setting yourself to paint them from another point of view?
If I went back and painted some of these things, the question is, have I ever gone back to some of the places I painted these things in and painted them from another point of view? Well, the only painting I could say that about would be the Broadway painting, because the others are, let's say, that they are from my imagination, but Broadway is from my memory. You know, I didn't sit there and paint the picture. Now, if I was to do it again, I'd have to have some reason to do it again. I'm not sure if I would, but would I put that? Yeah, would I remember it differently? Of course I would. I'd have to remember it differently. And when last time I went there, it wasn't as brightly coloured as I remember it, you know, as I put in the paintings. So yeah, it would have to be different, but I can't imagine why I'd want to go and do another painting of it. That's because I'd have to be, you know, when I was painting that, it was a memory that was quite close to me and was important to me. My life has changed so much. I think that's 2006 or something, or 2021. So it's a long time has gone, and I've got other interests now. I've moved on to other things.
All right.
Next
One
question.
last question. So this person's parish once had a workshop of prayer with the art of Mark Chagall. Have parishes, Catholic or otherwise, used your work to pray with? If not, would you be open to that? And are there materials, for example, on your website that people could use?
Yes, I'm very happy to the question. Do I know of parishes that might have used my work to pray with, or used my work in their services or whatever? And the answer to that is yes. Yeah, many times. I get requests a lot. I've got one guy who's got quite a lot of paintings. He's a Lutheran minister, and he has, which is something quite extraordinary for me, being a European in his church, a screen comes down and then a projector starts up and shows paintings as he's talking. And he uses, I give him full permission to use my work in those. Sometimes they go on the front of magazines, they go on the front of maybe carol service sheets and things like that. People, you know, they look through my website and they see something they like. If it's for nothing, if it's just something like that, I'm very happy just to give it. And if it's the front of a novel or something, or a CD, then of course there's some payment involved. But yeah, but it's very common. I probably get requests, you know, 2 or 3 a month. Any other questions? No?
Well, yeah, I guess I'll just finish what kind of in our context here. You know, we have a lot of students who are studying professional degrees and in combination with like a secular engagement of religious themes, which you said is kind of like passé in the art world a little bit. What would you say to a student who's interested in art in an increasingly professional world? Maybe a word of encouragement for them.
Well, I think you want me to give a word of encouragement to somebody who wants to become an artist and be a professional and work as a professional. It's incredibly hard to do, so I have to start off by saying if you think of something better. But if because I would say I wasn't very good at anything else, which is the reason I became an artist. And I've known people who were far better than I am, but and then they found another subject, and of course it was more stable, career-wise. But if you thought, yes, I really want to be an artist, I want to do this, I'll get great pleasure out of it, and I'm going to risk it, then my advice would be to be as broad as you possibly can. Don't just do painting. I mean, I work for the Eastern Arts Board, for example, for the Arts Council, and I had to learn so many different things in doing that. No one's interested in an artist who's just come out of college. You're not going to make money for 20 years. You're too fresh, really, I think. But I've made films, and I've made for Anglia Television. I've just recently got a play out in London. I've written books, and I've been an arts development officer, so working with artists in order to create happenings and things like that. So I've done an enormous amount of things, and I only continue to do painting because it started to pay for itself. It started to make money. So I thought, okay, I can drop something, because I've been self-employed most of my life because I'm unemployable. That's why I can't seem to take orders, and I always have ideas that are outside of the perimeter. So it's only since that church pub, it's sort of all gelled, and then I was able to move forward from there. But that's the only advice I can give. Just try as many different things as you can. Diversify. That's the word I'm looking for. Diversify. Yeah. Right. Is that the last question? Thank you very much, everybody. A very good question.
All right. Thank you.